Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall of Tetris blocks. It's Game Boy Works Volume 2, Episode 2.
Too hot to handle, too cold to hold. They call the Ghostbusters at the end control.
The history of Tetris sure was wild, wasn't it? All the dealing and haggling and legal wrangling and figuring out the licensing logistics of video game properties from a communist country, working its way into capitalism. Just a headache to really keep track of. And after all of that, Nintendo literally just gave the game away. It's actually a little strange to think about in this modern era where console manufacturers sell their machines on the nickel and dime model that Japan has always used. It used to be the case that American and European consoles didn't ship without a game until a little later in life, when the corporations wanted to lure the hesitant and budget-strapped with a rock-bottom entry price, the opposite of the way things work today, where the bundles come later. Meanwhile, in Japan, consoles didn't simply not ship with pack-in software, they often didn't include the components you needed to use the machine itself. I still remember my bewilderment at receiving an import GameCube for Christmas 2001 and being unable to hook the thing up to a television because Nintendo didn't feel the need to include a video cable in the box. That business practice spans all the way back to the Famicom, which didn't include a power brick, let alone a game. And of course it extends to the Game Boy, which shipped in Japan in a compact box that included the console manual headphones and batteries, but no link cable and no game. By several accounts, key Nintendo Corporation Limited figures hate the American practice of packing games in with the system, feeling they'd give away their best software for free and thus lose money hand over fist. That argument continued at least all the way through the Wii and Wii Sports. Of course, the results of the pack-ins speak for themselves. Not only did pack-in games enhance the appeal of the console to budget-minded shoppers, allowing them to get their new purchase up and running without the need to spend another chunk of cash on the peripherals and software to make it work, it also did a lot to build affection for the included games. I saw quite a few comments on my recent TMNT episode from UK-based fans who acquired the game as a pack-in with their NES and love it, despite its flaws as a result. The Super Mario series got a huge shot in the arm by shipping in the American NES action set during the console's crucial first years of life. And I think we all know someone with a non-gamer relative who still played Wii Sports years after everyone else had ceased to care about Wii. But I would posit that no single pack-in game has ever had quite the same impact as Tetris, which Nintendo included with launch-era Game Boy systems. Tetris may not have looked like much, especially if you saw it side by side with a Lynx kiosk running Blue Lightning, the way my local Walmart had things arranged in their electronics department. But you only needed to spend a few minutes with the game to find yourself hooked. The Tetris Game Boy pairing seems like a real stroke of destiny, a case of things falling into place, as it were, so perfectly that you probably couldn't have planned it. The timing truly was extraordinary. Tetris may have entered the world half a decade before Game Boy's arrival, but it didn't make its way west beyond the hermetic seals of the Soviet borders for a few years. And all the legal maneuvering around the game as licensors figured out the logistics of working out a deal amidst the vagaries of the concept of ownership within the waning days of the Soviet system, well, hooking up communist collectivism with Western capitalism was like trying to connect an AC power outlet to a DC-powered device. And, as we saw with Tengen's Tetris, some people received a nasty shock in the process. Nintendo and Bulletproof Software managed to get things straightened out with the game console rights to Tetris, a different legal point from computer and arcade rights, much to Tengen's dismay, just in time for the Game Boy's launch. BPS shipped their awkward rendition of Tetris for Famicom in November of 1988, at which point my understanding is that they sub-licensed the game to Nintendo. Tengen shipped Tetris for NES in May of the following year, and Nintendo beat that technically unauthorized release down and expunged it from the record within a matter of weeks, just in time for Tetris to arrive on Japanese Game Boys in June. All of this feels like a process of clearing the way, John the Baptist style, for the messianic arrival of Tetris for Game Boy at the system's US launch. You can tell Nintendo knew what it had here. The NES version of Tetris wouldn't ship until November 1989, even though the NES had the largest install base in the world at the time and took priority for Nintendo as a platform all throughout the years that the two systems' time on the market overlapped. NES Tetris was practically a guaranteed million seller, especially once Nintendo put its full marketing force behind promoting it. But they clearly grasped the fact that Game Boy Tetris would almost single-handedly sell millions of Game Boys, making it the more valuable move. You see this reflected in what Nintendo Power said. Tetris was the only Game Boy game that received any real coverage in the magazine for the system's first year or so on the market. Even Super Mario Land, an actual Mario game featuring Mario, the best-selling Nintendo mascot, got a paltry 2 pages of promotion. By comparison, Tetris absolutely luxuriated in its glorious 4-page promotional piece in issue 8. So posh. Plus, most of the magazine's early coverage centered around Tetris indirectly, using it as the showcase for example, link cable functionality. Plus, any feature that involved the more heavily promoted NES Tetris, like the adorable 16-page photodiorama comic Adventure in Tetris Land from the January-February 1990 issue, also doubled as coverage. And finally, Game Boy Tetris also received another 4-page feature in 1991's Game Boy Player's Guide. But then, maybe Nintendo didn't feel like they needed to push Game Boy Tetris too hard. After all, if you bought a Game Boy in the system's early days, you were getting a copy of Tetris whether you wanted it or not. But who wouldn't want it? Tetris encapsulated a perfect showcase of Game Boy's appeal. It was the ideal pick-up-and-play game. One of its 2 play modes involves simply clearing away 25 lines of blocks, a process that takes just a few minutes even at the lowest speed setting. And the simplicity of Tetris meant that the Game Boy's technical shortcomings didn't really matter. No, the system couldn't crank out vibrant graphics on a backlit screen, but Alexei Pejitnov originally designed the game to run on a text-based display. Tetris doesn't need graphics to work at all, just moving objects of any kind. The fact that Game Boy could display 23,000 pixels in 4 shades of gray, well, grayish, amounted to an unnecessary level of luxury for this particular work. Even in low lighting conditions, a hellish way to experience Game Boy, Tetris's simple graphics read well. I mean, I wouldn't recommend setting the speed to maximum in a dim room, but outside of ridiculous own-goal extreme environmental conditions like that, Tetris was literally a Game Boy game that you could play anywhere, anytime. If you had just a couple of minutes to kill, Mode B's 25-line objective would do the trick just fine. And if you had a little more time to sit and concentrate on the action, you could dive into Mode A, the endless Tetris mode. Compared to Tengen or even BPS Tetris, Game Boy Tetris seems a little anemic. It really only offers those 2 modes, with no real variables for play besides the starting speed and level of clutter that already populates the well once you start the game. Each level of play speed is the equivalent to the rate at which blocks drop after you've cleared 10 times that many lines in Mode A. That is to say, 0 is the glacial default speed, while level 5 is the much zippier speed that activates after you've removed 50 lines from the well. You can start at any speed between 0 and 9, though the game still continues to accelerate beyond 100 lines cleared. I have made it to nearly level 20 a couple of times, which requires incredible luck and a sort of out-of-body zen state of mind, but I have no idea if the speed continues to accelerate beyond that. Presumably the drop rate would exceed the Game Boy screen's ability to refresh at some point, thus rendering the game impossible. Other than that, the only play customization options amount to 3 different music selections: stereo mixes of traditional Russian tunes like Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies, and the option to play solo or against another person. But honestly, going with a streamlined approach was probably the right call for this particular piece of software. Not unlike Dragon Warrior for NES, Tetris for Game Boy was meant to serve as an introductory piece. In this case, the introduction wasn't for the software itself, or for its gameplay principles. Tetris defines intuitive design, unlike Dragon Warrior's relatively Byzantine menu system. But rather, it's an introduction for the Game Boy. This version of Tetris doesn't exactly burst at the seams with features and options, but bear in mind that up until this point, no one expected much from portable games. The Microvision had offered only the slightest, most limited games imaginable, and the world had long since forgotten it anyway by 1989. The Game Boy followed on the heels of decades of Game & Watch LCD units and their derivatives. Even at their most complex, namely the Zelda Game & Watch, which also debuted in August 1989, these simple handhelds were fundamentally limited by nature due to their lack of pixel-based graphics. Tetris on Game Boy paled in comparison to Tengen's NES release, sure, but realistically no one expected a portable game in 1989 to punch in the same weight class as a full console release. The fact that Tetris offered as many features as it did seemed downright miraculous when the standard it competed against was Tiger's Adventures of Bayou Billy Game & Watch knockoff. Really about the only shortcoming you can fairly ding it for is the lack of a backup battery to save high-score data. In an age before cheap digital photography, the thrilling sessions where you racked up an insanely high score during a lucid moment of Tetris Zen vanished into the ether the instant you shut down your Game Boy. And no one would ever believe you when you said things like, "I have made it to nearly level 20 a couple of times, which requires incredible luck and a sort of out-of-body Zen state of mind." No, a little backup and proof in the form of a permanent high score record would have been nice. That's a minor failing though. This version of Tetris, designed by Nintendo's R&D 1 team, emphasized two key elements of the Game Boy: its pick-up-and-play immediacy and its connectivity. The idea to include a cartridge that showcased Game Boy's connectivity was a stroke of genius on Nintendo's behalf, and it seems to have been a calculated move. The company's otherwise solid NES port of Tetris lacks any sort of head-to-head element. Competitive or cooperative Tetris was clearly not beyond the capabilities of the NES. Anyway, the half-year gap between Tengen's unlicensed release and the official NES cart meant that if Nintendo had somehow failed to consider the possibility of adding a two-player element to their version at first, they still would have had plenty of time to shoehorn something in at the last second. Now, I really suspect that NES Tetris lacks a competitive feature in order to let that aspect of the Game Boy release shine. Actually, now that I say it out loud, this theory sounds kind of stupid and conspiratorial, but I certainly have heard of dumber business decisions in this industry. The multiplayer in Game Boy Tetris takes a pretty simple competitive approach. Each player sees only their own well, with the current height of the rival's block pile denoted as a small meter on the left side of the screen. All you need to do in order to win a match is to endure by clearing blocks until the other player runs out of space in their well. Once the block pile reaches the kill line of a well, that player loses. The one chaos element that differentiates this from simply being two people playing independent games of Tetris is the garbage attack element. When you clear two lines or more in a single action, you fill the bottom of the other player's well with neutral blocks equal to the same number of lines that you've cleared. Needless to say, blasting your rival with a full 4-line Tetris that sends their pile shooting up is a real kick in the teeth that they may not be able to recover from. Of course, they can clear away the garbage blocks that you send over, assuming they can work their way down to reach them. But that's more easily said than done when a player is trying to clear away their own accumulation of blocks and mitigate the threat of a growing garbage pile from below. This simple attack concept means that Nintendo's competitive Tetris demands a surprising amount of strategy. On the one hand, there's value in keeping your own block stack simple in order to have easy access to the trash blocks your rival transmits. If you can clear away the new rows as your opponent fills them in, you'll have a real leg up on them. On the other hand, if you don't let blocks accumulate to a certain degree, you'll never clear more than a single row at a time, which means that you'll never clear enough lines to be able to send your own trash blocks their way. The defensive approach has merit, but being too timid gives your rival free rein to put together a string of multi-line clears that will absolutely inundate you with trash. Of course, because you see only a vague indication of your opponent's current status, you can't really know what approach they're taking. So you need to trust your instincts and decide how best to balance offensive and defensive play, which is a lot to juggle in your brain while also dealing with a constant rain of tetraminos. Is this the best version of Tetris? No, not really. Even if you don't mind the lack of modern niceties like infinite spin, Game Boy Tetris is awfully slight compared to subsequent takes on the game to necessarily be worth going back to 35 years later. But even if it's not the deepest, most fully featured take on Tetris, it might just be the most iconic. It even inspired an entire skin in Tetris Effect. Nintendo claims to have sold 43 million copies of Tetris across Game Boy and NES. I don't know exactly how those units break down, but I think it's safe to say that, as a pack-in title that would continue to be sold separately under the Player Choice banner for years, the lion's share of those sales happened on Game Boy. And yeah, I'm sure the bigwigs at NCL weren't thrilled as they didn't get to separate out millions, or maybe tens of millions, of those sales from the hardware itself and rake in the extra profits here in the US. Somehow though, I don't think they minded the way Tetris's inclusion in the Game Boy package inspired countless people to buy the system. You can't really do A/B testing on real life, at least not as far as I'm aware, but I suspect that if you could peer into an alternate timeline where NCL put the kibosh on Tetris as a Game Boy pack-in for America, you'd be looking into a universe where both the game and the system were just a little less popular. Sometimes synergistic events feel destined to happen a certain way, such that any other outcome sounds preposterous. And that's pretty much the Game Boy Tetris connection in a nutshell. It's hard to imagine a more perfect pairing of hardware and software in a more perfect moment. Next time on Game Boy Works, 1989 looks an awful lot like 1985, just a little greener.